Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Sela Social Studies. So today we're going to go over what we call titans of industry, or more often named captains of industry, or robber barons. Who are these guys? Are they one or are they other? Can they be both? So the Second Industrial Revolution led to an explosion of American industry, and it was industry that was controlled only by a few men. So there's no secret about the motive of these industrialists, and those motives were money, wealth, and power. The few businessmen who were leading the charge made millions, while the vast majority of Americans were still very poor. If you were part of the wealthy class, wealthy businessmen, they were called captains of industry. So if you were rich, you would look at these rich businessmen and you would say, boy, that guy's a captain of industry. The term captain views these men as ingenious and industrious leaders who transform the American economy with their business skills. However, if you were poor and you were part of the poor majority, these businessmen were what we call robber barons. So a robber is cruel and a ruthless businessman who would stop at nothing to achieve this great wealth that he has. So sometimes, usually, this robber baron made their millions unethically. So one of these views was that of a captain of industry. These men were revered for their ingenious ideas and how they led and transformed the American economy positively. A captain of industry during the Gilded Age that thrived off of the production of steel and was one of the most admired businessmen of the time. This was Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was born in Scotland and moved to the United States during the second wave of immigration, that Irish and German immigration into the United States. Now, Carnegie was one of the richest men in the history of the world, and he built what we call the Carnegie Steel Corporation, in which the majority of the steel coming from the Carnegie Steel Corporation was used for the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad and the railroad itself. Carnegie Steel Corporation used what we call the vertical integration of business approach to the creation of the production of his steel. So here's how that works. Carnegie owned businesses that were involved in each step of the manufacturing of the process of steel, coming from the raw material all the way to the sale of the finished product. Carnegie owned a business in each step of the way. He owned a business in raw material, he owned a business in processing, in refining, in production of, and then sale and distribution of his steel. This led to that product of steel being cheaper than the competition, allowing him to sell much more steel at a very low price. This vertical integration also led to the market value of steel to drop. So it didn't only drop in his business, but it dropped in the whole market. He ultimately sold his company to a banking magnate, J.P. Morgan, who would create the United States Steel Corporation. So Andrew Carnegie's net worth after the sale was near $480 million, inflated to today's value around $300 billion. Carnegie was a philanthropist, which means he gave to charities, and he gave most of his fortune away before he passed away in 1919. So on the flip side of the coin are robber barons. This view of businessmen accentuates the negativity in industry. Some industrialists that were portrayed as robber barons are Cornelius Vanderbilt and John D Rockefeller, men who would stop at nothing to achieve this great wealth. Robber barons would force horrible and unsafe working conditions onto the laborer, and it is most likely because of these robber barons that labor unions were formed. A robber baron that we will discuss and focus on is John D Rockefeller. Rockefeller was the owner of the Standard Oil Company, which was the country's largest oil and gas refinery. Standard Oil also owned most of the gas dispensaries like that you would find at a gas station. And unlike Carnegie, Rockefeller implemented a horizontal integration approach to business. What horizontal integration was is when the Standard Oil Company purchased all of the competition in the oil refining business, thus creating the Standard Oil monopoly. So instead of going up and down and owning a step in every part of the business, he owned everything across horizontally. So a monopoly is created from that because there are no other pieces of that puzzle, no other oil refiners. It's all going to be Rockefeller. He's going to be the only guy. And a monopoly is when one company owns all the businesses in the same field and squeezes out any competition. Rockefeller then formed a trust which grouped many of these companies under a single board. So captains of industry and robber barons depicted the difference between the good and the bad industrialists, but was parallel with industry itself. So there were some positive and negatives of both. So industry was not solely based on factories and machines. While they were a big part, they're just inanimate objects without the people. Immigrants came to America and gobbled up all those unskilled factory labor jobs in factories, making industrialists millions of dollars. After all, this is what the Gilded Age and industry was all about: wealth, money, and power. These rural living and small farm successes were beginning to become a thing of the past, and Americans were flocking to the cities by record numbers for these factory jobs. Big business became the driving force in America, and in order for this to happen, conditions needed to be primed for production. So how does that happen? Well, here they are. One reason why businessmen were able to make so much money was because the United States government did nothing to stall its growth. This is called laissez-faire capitalism. And simply put, laissez-faire capitalism is the most pure form of capitalism. It literally means hands off, meaning the government would be hands off the industrialization in the United States. Businessmen felt that this was the best way for industry to flourish, to run unchecked or unimpeded, and to take whatever actions needed or were necessary to be successful. If American laborers or American citizens were affected negatively in the process, oh well. The government was not there to help the people or to get involved in business ventures. And because of this laissez-faire capitalism, Americans, especially American laborers, needed to be tough. If things were not going their way, they needed to deal with it. If they did not like where they were at in life, they needed to change it. At the beginning of the Great Depression, President Hoover said Americans needed to pick themselves up by the bootstraps, that the government had no business stepping in to help Americans. This eventually created a generation of tough Americans who had a unyielding work ethic. So, who was going to survive during a Gilded Age? An analogy that I've heard and love to use, and one that I've used before in these videos, is that the Golden Age was like a golden-covered turd. When the world looked at the United States, what they saw was this giant pile of gold. However, when you scratch off that thin outer layer of gold, well, you're left with the turd. Was everyone getting rich? No. Were most Americans getting rich? No. Were a lot of Americans getting rich? No. So who was going to survive? So many Americans and the government finally started to view big business as a problem during the late 1800s. Business paid their laborers next to nothing. Working conditions were poor to say the least, and there was still child labor. Americans were fuming, but industrialists did not care. They believed in what we call social Darwinism. This is the application of Charles Darwin's philosophy of survival of the fittest, basically saying that only the strong will survive or the hardworking will become wealthy. These businessmen placed this theory into businesses as well. They felt that if the company was not strong enough, it would fail. Or if you didn't work hard enough, you would be poor and your company would fail as well. If you didn't like that hard work and perseverance, hey, that's up to you. Remember, not all industrialists were like this though. Carnegie, Leland, Stanford, and even Rockefeller at times were philanthropists, which gave away large sums of money. So it wasn't always just negatively, only the strong survive. So in capitalism, healthy competition is a good thing. These competitors compete to earn our dollar, and most of the time that made the price of goods cheaper. As business became more successful, their social Darwinism kicked into high gear and wanted to eliminate all its competition. Since the government was hands-off, businesses were able to run freely as they do and please. This meant making themselves the only viable option in the field. So because laissez-faire capitalism is so pure and governments were so blind, laissez-faire eliminated competition itself. And when a business eliminated a competition, a monopoly took shape. So monopolies are bad because they could set the price of product as high as they want because they're the only company that you can get the product from. And when Standard Oil was a monopoly, the only place where you could refine oil was through Rockefeller, which meant that he got all the money and could charge whatever he wanted. So most monopolies purchased several organizations like Rockefeller and put them under one umbrella, simply known as a trust. Here's a picture of the Standard Oil Company stock with a factory of what it looks like. So many people believe that businesses earn their fortunes through unfair business practices and use their size and strength to drive out the competition. Bullies. Once these businesses formed a trust, the trust became bullies in the market. They would sell their products at a lower cost than most smaller competitors, wait for them to go out of business, or purchase them, and then raise their prices. People believed that when a trust became too powerful, they would become a monopoly and eliminate competition and control the market. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which made it illegal to create monopolies or trusts that restrained trade. The act's flaw was that it did not clearly define what a trust was, so it was hard to legally control or stop the trust. It would be used successfully later by President Theodore Roosevelt and Taft, and as a result, these trusts continued to grow in size and power. So in the late 1800s, many business owners formed corporations that sold what we call stock shares, and a stock share is a portion of ownership of the company. Many Americans felt that this was their way of being part business owner, and these stocks were able to be bought and sold on the stock exchange. Many corporate leaders who sold stocks were very respected for their contributions to the economy, and when the business was a success, the owners and the investors who held stocks were rewarded, and corporations encouraged more investments because it would help keep the business healthy through the purchase of the sale of stock.